yourself in the middle of nowhere. It's a waste. Extravagant devotion is often seen as a waste. And the other one was Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell, that fantastic sprinter, Olympic runner, he wouldn't run on a Sunday out of devotion to Jesus. He wouldn't run on a Sunday and was criticised. He was unpatriotic. He was told many things, and insults were given him. People didn't understand his extravagant devotion. So that's the second thing. People won't understand our extravagant devotion. They think our lives should be spent in the pursuits of hobbies and pleasure, of enjoying ourselves, and we shouldn't expect everyone to be patting us on the back. We should prepare to be misunderstood. The third thing is that extravagant devotion to Jesus stops the rot. Extravagant devotion stops the rot. Where does that come from? So just read verses 10 and 11. So there's this extravagant devotion, and then the next line that we read is, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them." So you've got this action, and we know from one of the other Gospels that Judas is one of the ones, maybe the chief one, who shouted out, "Why waste this money? Why waste this money?" And then soon as he saw that Jesus gave the commendation to this lady, we read that then he goes out to seek to betray Jesus. In a way, it was the last straw for him. If the money wasn't going to be given to the money bag from this alabaster jar, Judas was going to go and get money from somewhere else. So you get the sense as you read through the Gospels that Judas was never really devoted to Jesus. He perhaps was more devoted to money and status and power. So he goes off to the chief priest to get his silver coins. I don't think it's by accident that as we read through Mark's Gospel, you have this act of extravagant devotion between verses 1 and 2 and between verses 10 and 11. So you've got this bright light, this beautiful act, and on either side you just have these couple of short verses. At the top you've got the religious leaders plotting to kill Jesus, and at the bottom you've got Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, colluding with them. So it's almost like the bright, beautiful devotion in the middle, and either side the spiritual rottenness. I say that because if you compare with the other Gospels, actually the act of devotion happens 6 days before the Passover. So John tells us that 6 days before the Passover, you have this great act of devotion, and yet we read at the beginning of chapter 14, it was 2 days before the Passover that the chief priests were plotting. So if we were going chronologically, Mark would have had act of devotion and then plotting, but he's not done that. He's chosen to put the plotting first, then the act of devotion, then Judas' betrayal. So I think he's trying to make a point here, and I think the point is, if we don't want to be a Judas, be a Mary. If we don't want to be a Judas, be a Mary. The antidote to spiritual rottenness is extravagant devotion. I don't know about you, sometimes I look along life's journey and I think, man, I could have many years to walk on this Christian road. And there are times the battle feels fierce, and I feel like I know many people who seem to have been going along very well the Christian life, and years down the line they reject all that they had once known. And there are many warnings through the New Testament about this apostasy, this rejection of Jesus. And I think if we want to ensure we're not a Judas, we've got to be a Mary. We've got to pour our lives out in extravagant devotion to Jesus. And one of the ways God keeps his children close to him is through the Word. And I think this contrast and the way this passage is structured, with the devotion in the middle and the rottenness on the outside, is a reminder to us. It's an exhortation to us to keep our devotion to Jesus, not to hold back when it comes to showing him devotion. You see, this woman, Mary, she was never going to be a Judas, was she? There was no chance if you asked Mary in that moment, will you betray Jesus? No, she wasn't going to be a Judas. She knew Jesus. She loved him. As I looked at this passage, there was I had a spectrum in my head. There was Mary at this end, this bright light of extravagant devotion. And then there was Judas at this end, this spiritual rottenness. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not a Mary. I'm not a Mary. Where on this spectrum? I think somewhere midway. But I can't say my devotion is like Mary's at the minute. £20,000 burst over Jesus' head. Maybe I put myself somewhere where the disciples are. So it's not long after that we read about Peter's denial. He's full of what he will do, how he'll never forsake Jesus. And yet he denies him. I want to be devoted, but at times I find myself holding back. And maybe you're there, maybe not. Maybe you're Mary. You're full of devotion. Your heart burns for Jesus. I would say keep going. Keep living a life of extravagant devotion to Jesus. But for those of us who maybe find ourselves back along the spectrum, I just want to think about where does this devotion flow from? So if all you hear this morning is go and be devoted, go and be devoted, go and be devoted, probably not too helpful. So where does this devotion flow from? Why does Mary do what she does? Why does she put all this perfume on Jesus' head? Well, I think she knows Jesus. She knows who he is. She sat at his feet. It was Mary who longed to just sit at his feet when Martha was busy serving. It's Mary who has had a brother raised to life. She knows Jesus, and this devotion flows out of knowing Jesus and seeing him. And we're just going to look a little bit further ahead in preparation to coming to the Lord's table and see what is it that's going to stir our devotion to Jesus? What is it that's going to make our heart long to live for him? A few verses after this account, so verses 12 onwards to 30, we have Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples. This lamb that would be killed in place of the people of Israel. And there's another kind of, if you will, sandwich here. We have Jesus sharing this meals with his disciples. On either side we have Judas' betrayal and Peter's denial. So Judas' betrayal verses 10 to 11, Peter's denial verses 26 to 30. And in the middle we see Jesus serving his disciples the Passover meal. And during the meal, Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it. He says, "This is my body." That's verse 22. And after that, he took the cup, verse 23, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them and they drank all of it. And then he said to them, "This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Now, I don't know if this is just chance or whether this was intended, but what we have is we have this lady in her act of devotion. She breaks the alabaster flask and pours it on his head. And then we have Jesus in the upper room, taking the bread, he breaks the bread and he pours out the wine and he says, "I have done this for you." So if we're going to live lives of extravagant devotion to Jesus, we have to see his extravagant love and faithfulness to us. The difference is Mary's act of devotion was to someone who was infinitely worthy. Even £20,000 is insignificant compared to the glory that the Son of God deserves. And yet Jesus' act of devotion and faithfulness is to those who are unworthy, his disciples. One will betray him, one will deny him. And even in that upper room, Jesus does this. He's going to die on the cross in just a few hours for the sins of his followers, for God's children. And yet even there, he will still show covenant faithfulness. Romans 5 says, "For while we were still weak, and at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So while this woman shows extravagant devotion to Jesus, who is infinitely worthy, Jesus shows extravagant faithfulness and love to us who are completely unworthy. And maybe this morning, as I looked at this passage, you've been convicted by your lack of devotion to Jesus. Maybe the coldness of your service. Maybe the infrequency of extravagance in your devotion. The key is to come back and to ponder this table, to ponder his cross, to ponder his extravagance. That's what will turn our hearts. And maybe this morning Jesus means very little to you. The call is the same, to come to the table, to see what he has done on your behalf. Come and see again Jesus on the night before he died. See how he offers himself to his disciples. See his faithful, covenant-keeping love. See his extravagance. We're going to come around the Lord's table in a moment. Before we do, we're going to sing a song that will help us just think and reflect prayerfully on what Jesus has done for us. So we'll sing the first two verses of this song, "Oh, to see the dawn of the darkest day, Christ